intent that anybody actually believe in them, but harder than you'd think to actually pin down. There are a lot of ways that the problem manifests. One is, of course, creatures from all the previous categories appear in fiction, and indeed there's a lot of bleed between the categories. Many cryptozoological monsters were thought to be prehistoric survivals, and many ancient writers doubted the reality of certain monsters, making those more old cryptozoology than proper mythozoology. These categories are based on belief, and belief is a slippery thing, as is well known by clinical psychologists and anyone who's been in any arguments on Facebook. It even operates in the other direction. A few years ago, there was a Create an Urban Legend contest on a website, and the winner was Slender Man, an impossibly gaunt-suited man without a face who stole children. The inception of this contest, its progress and conclusion are all matters of public record. Its winners are proud of their victory, and have people come to believe that Slender Man is real anyway? Say it with me. Oh my heavenly Lord, what is wrong with people? Another complication is that 1,000 years later, it is sometimes hard to determine whether someone was just kidding. For all we know, the Hohenstein Strudel lion person and the Twelfth sorcerer were beloved children's entertainers with high-pitched voices and a lot of things to say about friendship and staying away from tar pits. And all the adults just hated them until they passed away at age 25. Even when we have stories, authorial intent is difficult to divine. Maybe Bellerophon riding a winged horse that was born from the blood of a woman with snakes for hair in order that he might kill a lion with a snake for a tail and a goat's head coming out of its back for some reason was a story that was meant to be thought of as literally true, which is certainly the baseline assumption, and maybe it wasn't because of literally any part of it. The Epic of Gilgamesh, generally regarded as the first known piece of literature, features a two-fisted hero called Gilgamesh, luckily enough, and his beast-man sidekick Enkidu. Running around battling giants and killing the bull of heaven and generally being rowdy. They were kids, they killed the bull of heaven. Who hasn't had a wild weekend or two when they killed the bull of heaven? It's plainly a ripping adventure yarn, but then also the gods show up and tell us things about the nature of death. So is this a religious text that we're supposed to believe to be true or not? Impossible to say at this point. Over in the Hindu religion, there's the Ramayana, an ancient epic with a city of monsters and a species of benign monkey people and flying conveyances and fiery super weapons, and it's more Star Wars than Star Wars 1,000 years before Star Wars, 2,000, thousands of years before Star Wars. And this is a legitimate part of the Hindu faith. But is it taken perfectly literally? Hard to say, and probably varies from person to person. It may sound like all of these are too impossibly absurd to be taken seriously at all. But it is important to remember that here in our culture, there's a book with a guy whose muscle power is based on his hair growth, and a dragon with 7 heads is thrown out of his home in the sky, and there are a lot of people who think that if anyone thinks this is not all true, those people should be denied basic human rights, and then if you tell them they can't do that to the non-believers, that counts as a denial of their basic human rights. That, of course, is stupid. There are a few ancient works, however, that are rather easier to peg. Lucian of Samosata's True History, written in ancient Greek, was an obvious satire of the travel tales of the time, perhaps most notable for the hero's ship being swept up in a whirlwind for 7 days and then being deposited on the moon. There they find themselves embroiled in a war between the King of the Moon and the King of the Sun, with armies of mushroom people and dog-faced men flying on winged acorns and cloud centaurs. And I'm not 100% about this, but I assume cloud centaurs are small clouds with a human torso rising out of one end, and that is amazing, you guys. This might all sound a little, I don't know, silly to modern ears. But this is because it sounded a little silly to classical ears. This was a satire of the travelers' tales of the time, in which dog-faced men had only just enough decency to not ride on winged acorns. Between the 8th and the 10th centuries came the Arabian Thousand and One Nights, with talking trees, jinns, mermaids, and of course rocks. In one of its many stories, Sinbad the sailor comes upon the enormous egg of one of these sky-spanning birds, and initially takes the egg to be a mosque. And I don't know a lot about 9th century Muslim architecture, but I am impressed by the implication. The 1001 Nights is one of the earliest known written collections of folk tales. And this, of course, gives us another angle on the fictional monsters. Local folklore and fairy tales may or may not demand the weight of belief, but are frequently too bizarre and trivial to really successfully command it. I mean, I don't mean to say that the stories of a cat wearing boots aren't super serious. If you have a cat, I bet it could wear boots and have adventures, because your cat is the best of all cats. So I'm led to believe. Around this time and off to the north came Beowulf. Not a satire or a fairy tale like the above, but a men's adventure tale without any deities showing up, and most probably taken as a work of fiction in the time. This epic poem featured Grendel, a badly described ogre who liked to tear people's limbs off. Our hero Beowulf tore Grendel's limbs off to prove his moral superiority. This attracted the wrath of the mother of Grendel, known in the poem as Grendel's mother. She and Beowulf have a terrible fight, underwater no less, until Beowulf had wrestled Grendel's mother until she would wrestle no longer. 50 years later, Beowulf's home is attacked by a dragon. The dragon does so because a single trinket has been stolen from its lair. It flies forth, raining fiery breath down on mankind, and if this sounds familiar to you, it is because this dragon was cribbed directly to create the villain of that seminal work of 20th century fantasy, Beastmaster. Or The Hobbit. The gold hoarding, the flight, and the fiery breath were not necessary aspects of dragons until Beowulf, and indeed this is thought of as the first Western fire-breathing dragon. Dragons, you'll remember, had once been great serpents, and as such, extremely poisonous. Later, the poison would be so potent that it would waft in clouds out of their mouths, and then this later turned into out-and-out fire. Beowulf's dragon was the first of the modern stripe, codified for the 20th century by Smaug, and then later by Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which taught us that this was a huge ancient red dragon. Not one, not two, but 88 hit points. Later we get more satirical monsters in Jonathan Swift's 1726 book Gulliver's Travels, with its noble talking horses and giants and tiny little people. But the newly invented fictional monster as a serious subject would first appear in modern literature in an obscure and forgotten 1818 novel, assuming you've never heard of Frankenstein. This was really the first fictional monster in a modern novel, and I think it's going to do pretty well, that it's got a big future. This is famously the story of a mad scientist who claims the power to create life that really belongs to God himself, a story of hubris and arrogance and man's reach exceeding his grasp. The funny thing about that is completely not the story at all. There are a few vague references to these ideas in the book, but it is much, much more so the story of a man who creates life and immediately abandons it, and the consequences of all that. When Victor is first confronted with the creature he has created, he immediately just leaves, wandering the streets for hours, thinking to himself, boy, I sure hope that's gone when I get back. Not word for word, but I'm not kidding. And he gets back, and the monster is gone, and he thinks to himself, phew, glad that's over. Later in the book, the monster makes Victor promise to create for him a bride, but then later the scientist changes his mind, not over some moral or scientific conflict, but because he doesn't want to. Victor is irresponsible to the point of the hilarious, and the novel he's in is more of a response to the ridiculously self-indulgent heroes of Gothic literature than it is to the rise of science. For more on this, please see my upcoming piece, Frankenstein D-Bag, which I'll be performing twice in October. See RevMadsMonsterScience.com or its associated Facebook or Instagram for updates. Also, I wrote a book. Also, sometimes they would put monsters into moving pictures. No, calm down, I'm serious. The first of these to be in a full-length picture rather than in some long-forgotten short was the vampire Count Orlok from F.W. Murnau's 1922 film Nosferatu. Here's this for no real reason. This film was inspired by the literary Dracula and also by a cease and desist order forbidding it from referring to its monster as Dracula. It's in the German expressionistic style, and it's an excellent film, dark and moody and scary and largely free of sparkling or Kiefer Sutherland. We also need to note 1925's The Lost World, based, legally this time, on a story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Dinosaurs are found in South America, and a sauropod is brought back to London. And check this out, it escapes and wreaks havoc. Because of course it does, but what you've got to remember is that this had never happened on a movie screen before. And can you even imagine watching a movie in which a huge prehistoric animal is brought to a major city and wondering what might happen next? The mind reels. This was also some of the early work of special effects master Willis O'Brien, who would later create King Kong. And apparently his work here caused grown men in early showings to scream and swoon, so horrified were they by such apparently real monsters. Now, of course, they build a Peter Cushing out of ones and zeros, and we all sigh heavily. Much as with credulity in cryptozoology, I don't know that I exactly endorse the 1925 reaction, but it does have a real charm. So began the horror movie, and so began the giant monster movie. And there were a couple more of each of these. But I'm afraid my nickel is up. This, then, has been the complete history of like 2% of monsters. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for coming, you guys. This is so exciting to me. This is the first time I've headlined a thing, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Fearless Comedy for putting on the show. Thank you so much to the Phoenix for everything they've done. Like I said in the thing, look me up at redmansmonsterscience.com, Facebook, Instagram. Look up Fearless Comedy, Facebook, Instagram. And come back here on October 28th at 10:30 for Killer Bees movie improv. And thank you so much once again.